Welcome to the DonorWise Learning Library. This session is on the bank import module and specifically the new multiple designation feature. This is a great new feature in DonorWise 2.0 that allows you to take a single incoming donation from your bank import and split it among multiple designations. This particular topic is actually broken up into two parts. The first part is on setting up the bank profile and how to do that using all of these new features. The second part will actually be just showing you a bank import using the same file. Quick overview of what we're going to talk about. We're going to use the same bank file as before. Now you may not be familiar with our specific bank file, but you're not going to change anything about the bank file you've been using. However, there are some new things. Number one is a new total tendered amount target field. This ensures that the correct amount gets imported into DonorWise even when there are multiple splits in the donation. To make all this work, we're going to add some new derived fields, one for each designation and amount. So if we have one reference field from the bank that we're going to use for the donor ID, we're going to make derived fields from that, 6 of them, for example, for 3 designation import, one for each designation and one for each amount, for 6 total. To do that, we actually need to combine a description and an amount to make sure there's a unique match. And then we're going to use wildcards for fields that do not have multiple designations. The reality is most of the donations from your bank import will not have multiple designation splits, and so we'll use wildcards to ignore those rows when that happens. Okay, before we jump into DonorWise, just want to look real quick at where this is controlled. In the System Setup area, the Tools, System Setup, on the Donations tab actually shows you the batch import and the number of designations that are possible per row. All right, let's take a look at DonorWise and where we're going to see this happen. We're going to start with the import batch, and I'll just type a sample name here. My import profile is Toontown Bank, and this is a new profile for this. You may have an existing profile for your bank that you'll just want to modify. I want to change this to bank transfer and find my file. And here I am in the bank import screen. Now some of the things have not changed. For example, the donation date is not changed and the amount is still there. By the way, I'm assuming that you are already familiar with the bank import procedure. This is just designed to help you understand the new features in DonorWise 2.0. So I'm going to go ahead and assign the receive date to the receive date, and then this description 1 field that I have down here is going to be my skip record field, and so those are easy to assign. This description 2 field, as I already mentioned, is going to become my donor ID field. It's also going to be the source for all of my other derived fields. And then this amount field in the past would have been tendered amount, but now it's a new field called total tendered amount. And what this is designed to do is to enable DonorWise to add up the totals from each of the designations and ensure that they equal the amount that is imported for the entire donation. Now let me go ahead and create these derived fields. I select the Derived Fields tab, and then I select the New Derived Field button. And the first field I'm going to create is Designation ID. And I'm going to name this Designation ID 1 because I'm going to have 3. And I'm going to add a field, and I'm using description 2. Now if you're familiar with the bank import from before, this is probably what you had to do to create the designation ID in your bank import. What I am doing is duplicating this description 2 field so that we can use one copy of it for the donor ID that I've already defined and the second copy for the designation ID, but I'm actually going to do that multiple times. Now here's the challenge with this. Because I'm going to be using this field multiple times, I need to ensure that if a donor changes their giving amount in the future, either changes the number of designations that they are supporting or changes the amounts for one of those, and therefore the bank amount changes, I want to ensure that DonorWise catches that change. So I'm actually going to add another field here called amount, and then the combination of those two together is what's going to be designation ID 1. Okay, so now you see that it's this description 2 plus this amount of 25 that creates that field right there. Now I'm going to duplicate this again so that I can assign the amount for designation 1. So I'm going to name this tendered amount 1. I'm going to add the field. It's the same exact information I added before. And now I have the designation ID and the tendered amount. Now notice that in this list, designation ID and tendered amount do not have the number 1 next to them. That's because if you're only importing one designation ID or tendered amount, you don't need a 2 or 3 or a 1. Also, because the import profile will continue to work for any ministry without any changes until they use multiple designations, and so the field names are going to remain the same. So now I have one column for the designation ID 1 and one for the tendered amount 1. But I have 3 in my setup, so I need to do this 2 more times to get all 3 of them. So I'm going to name this one designation ID 2. I'll wait to refresh this till I'm finished. And then tendered amount 2. Then designation ID 3. And tendered amount 3. And this time I am going to refresh the source data. And now I have these fields ready to be assigned. I'm going to map designation ID 2 and designation ID 3 and tendered amount 2 and tendered amount 3. Now if I had 4 or 5 or 10 designations allowed in my tools system setup where I define the number of designations, those would appear in this list here as well. So it would say designation ID 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, or 10. So it selects only 3 because 3 is my default number. Okay, so that's how I've created the derived fields and I've done the field mapping. Now there's one other thing I want to do before we move into actually assigning all of the items for this particular bank import. And that is, I want to add the wildcards while I'm here. Now if we look at this list, I've got 3 donations here. One from Peter Pan, one from Donald Duck, and one from Daffy Duck. And in my example that I'm going to show you in the next video, this donor, Peter Pan, is only supporting 1 staff member. But the problem is that DonorWise is now going to be expecting 3 from this person. And so what we're going to do is create a wildcard that says if this donation does not have multiple designations, then ignore it. And the way I do that is I select any one of these items in this column and I say edit cross-references. This brings up the cross-references box, and I want to use a wildcard as the pattern style. Literal means where this text appears, pan Pete 16 ... then use this designation or amount. That's a literal. This value equals that value. A wildcard says that when no value appears, and by that I'm going to put a star and leave this blank, where there is no value or any value that DonorWise doesn't recognize, then use a blank value. So I'm going to leave this to box blank and save that. I'm going to do the same for tendered amount 2 and save that. And then designation ID 3. And tendered amount 3. And then I'm going to close. Now you see that in this table below, these values are still red because DonorWise does not recognize them as a DonorWise value. But these are black, meaning it does recognize them as a value because it's a blank value. And that's how we set up the wildcards. And this will make a little more sense to you in the next video when we actually show how the values are assigned to the fields. Okay, so that's how we set up the bank import profile and create the derived fields and assign the wildcards. In the next video, we're going to walk through the actual fields and assign them to the correct values that DonorWise will recognize.